Well, as people are joining us, let me welcome you, everybody, to Scriptural Encounter. This is fourth, the fourth in our series of Religion and the Problem of War, which we're holding under the auspices of the Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Manchester. If you were able to join us for any or for all of the first three, you'll know that we started by focusing on the war in Ukraine. And we were fortunate in being given the perspectives of Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Catholic, and Roman Catholic speakers. And that we've now broadened the scope to look at the theme of war more generally. Last time we had a Jewish historical scriptural presentation by Rabbi Professor Reuven Firestone on the subject of holy war, which may strike you as oxymoronic as a title, but that's what it was called, holy war, though it was debatable whether there is such a concept. So we're now into the area of theology, which is the primary territory of Scriptural Encounter and the fraught subject of how war can be justified theologically. Before we go on, I just want to say a word or two about my background behind me here. It's a mosque in Bosnia where I visited some years ago with the National Council of Imams and Rabbis, Sarajevo, Srebrenica. This is the FHEA Mosque in Banja Luka, one of several destroyed by the Bosnian Serbs, completely devastated, several mosques all over that particular city and others as part of their ethnic cleansing rampage. It was destroyed in 1992 in that war. It took another 14 years for it to be rebuilt. And I can show you other images. I'm showing you now a destroyed synagogue. I said synagogue, that's a Freudian slip. Well, I'm identifying very, very, very closely with it. So you can probably see my background has now changed to this one, which is another Banja Luka mosque. And then to make it a bit more positive, I'm going to show you a background of a restored mosque. This is in Srebrenica, beautiful. The white mosque, which was completely razed to the ground and then rebuilt. So you can't keep the spirit, the ruach or ruh in Arabic down, because it emanates from a higher source. And so I think that's a good setting for our subject today, which is the Islamic perspective. And I'm delighted to welcome Mufti Amjad Mohammed. Wonderful to have you with us. You've come straight from your family holiday and just about had time to catch your breath. So we're really honored and privileged to have you. If I could just say a few words about you for the benefit of those people who may not have heard of you, but you're so well known that they really ought to have heard of you. You're the founder and principal of the Islamic seminary Dar al-Ulam al-Zaytaniya, the Olive Foundation based in Bradford, which consists of secondary schools and elementary academies for Islamic studies, as well as higher academies. You're a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, very prestigious national body, giving recognition for the most important work that you do. telling everybody that Mufti Amjad is the Dean and Head Researcher of the Institute for the Revival of Traditional Islamic Sciences, or IRTIS, which provides critical research on the validity and coherence of traditional Islam within contemporary global society. And you're the Dean of that institution and also lecturer in various places, in Bradford University, also the Islamic Jurisprudence and Hadith Studies of the Islamic University of Applied Sciences in Rotterdam. You lecture in Islamic Theology undergraduate program. You're the Principal Jurisconsult of Markaz al-Ifta wa Qāḍī, a leading center for religious consultancy, spiritual care, and advisory judgments, which provides hundreds of advisory opinions to members of the public and public services around the country. I'm hesitating because so many people are joining us. I have to do the admin of letting everyone in, which is wonderful.
I'm helping you on the admin there, Bob. I know you're busy, so I'm stepping in.
Thank you. So
you can add that to the list of credentials there, you know.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say about the good work you do in the wider area beyond the academic world, which is as the recently taken up role you've contracted as Chief Sharia Officer of the National Zakat Foundation, which is a worldwide organization. We were having a chat about this earlier, the distinction between in Jewish tradition of Gemilut Chasadim and Tzedakah, which has its parallel with Zakat and Sadaqah in Arabic. So there's the concern for your own community, but also the widest community in terms of giving of one's and sharing of one's resources. So let me also mention, Mufti Amjad, your many publications. If I were to talk about them all, it could take up most of our time here. But just to mention one, your work on, you've written a book, published a book on Muslims in non-Muslim lands. It's a legal study with many applications, published by the Islamic Text Societies in Cambridge in 2013. And you've published many articles and books on Islamic jurisprudence, minority jurisprudence, theology, tafsir studies, hadith studies, Islamic bioethics, and Islamic finance. So you have the widest possible expertise and interest, and you've lectured on many of these subjects and carried out many media presentations, conferences, nationally as well as internationally. Mufti Amjad has told me that he prefers an even split of time, talking followed by questions and answers. So feel free to address us until 4:45, Mufti, and then we can invite people to interact with you.
Okay, I'll start with a short prayer. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen, nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'du, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon to everybody. As in the true academic way, we like to problematize. So when I got your notes, Bob, this is presenting the religious tradition and the problem of war. In terms of what we're doing and for today's discussion. The structure I have, I'm going to cover a few kind of key areas. One is introduce people to the concept of fiqh which is the kind of sometimes translated as positive law, but in reality, it is the practical applied law. Understanding what contextual setting is, killing another human, what worldview needs to exist, or what worldview does Islam portray? And then, is there a justification of war? And if there is a justification of war, what are the parameters? What are the causes of it? And then we'll speak a little bit about the guiding principles and finish off with some conclusions and questions. As Bob has introduced it, my aim is that I'll speak for about sort of 25 minutes or so, maybe half an hour, and then we will open up to questions after that. Okay, so first let's try to understand what fiqh is. So for those who, I may be sort of preaching to the converted to some extent, and for others it may be that this is at a slightly higher level, and that's one of the difficulties of trying to present a topic which requires some specialist understanding to a relatively wide audience of attendees. So in terms of when I speak about text, when I speak about scriptures, obviously I'm referring to the Quran itself, and then to the body of ahadith, which are the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. So these are the two key scriptures that Muslim scholars utilize in order to determine Islam's position with respect to anything. Obviously, the Quran is a finite text with 6,000 odd verses, whereas the ahadith are somewhat more plentiful. The Prophet ﷺ spoke, and his wording was recorded over a period of 23 or so years, and therefore there is no kind of fixed number. However, even the ahadith are understood to be graded, and what I mean by graded is to ensure that these were the words that were uttered by the Prophet. So you get various definitions like sahih, hasan, da'if, and things of that nature. However, when it comes to the great majority of Muslims, then they adhere to one of the four main legal schools. And they are the Hanafi legal school, the Maliki legal school, the Shafi legal school, and the Hanbali legal school. And you find, for example, when we go to the Mughal Empire, following on then where we had the British India, you would find that majority there was the Hanafi legal school being applied. Similarly, the latest Ottoman Empire, again, you would find that the Hanafi legal school was applied. So these aren't legal schools that are just particular to individuals to practice their own, how to perform ablution, how to perform salah, how to give zakah, but this is also relevant up to state level. So this was a state level law, which covered how the state should be run and how it should be organized. So that's what we speak of legal schools. So now, obviously, when we find ourselves, particularly as Muslims here in the West, Muslims in Europe, that we have these books of fiqh, the kutub al-fiqh, that we use, and we tend to derive principles from there. So we have what we refer to as text, but we also have context. And this is very important because for those who are of a maths orientation, it is text plus context which gives a person fiqh. And that leads us to understanding that when we find that the Islam as it's practiced is not a codified system, that Sami'a Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he heard the Prophet alayhi salatu say, إِذَا حَكَمَ الْحَاكِمُ فَاجْتَهَدَ ثُمَّ أَصَابَ فَلْهُ أَجْرَانِ وَإِذَا حَكَمَ فَاجْتَهَدَ ثُمَّ أَخْطَأَ. I'm just going to minimize this. فَلَهُ أَجْرٌ. The Amr ibn As radiallahu anhu, he narrates, a companion of the Prophet, that I heard the Messenger of Allah say that when a hakim, when a person who is being given the judiciary power, when he judges on something, fajtahada, he applies himself. He applies himself legally. Okay, so he has to try to derive a position. He has to try to derive an understanding. Summa asaba, and if he gets it correct, okay, so that determines that there's a correct answer, then he will get two rewards. وَإِذَا حَكَمَ فَاجْتَهَدَ ثُمَّ أَخْطَأَ فَلَهُ أَجْرٌ. If, on the other hand, he applies himself and he makes error, then he will have a single reward. So first of all, it's talking about those individuals who have legal capacity. So the understanding the fiqh to derive a position, for example, what does Islam say with regards to war and how it can be waged and what are the requirements? then there has to be some level of ijtihad, some level of effort, legal effort that the hakim makes. And then if he gets it correct, he gets 2 rewards. But if he errs, if he makes an error, then he still gets a reward. Why is that? Why is he still getting a reward even though he's erring? Because he is applying the system that has been left by the Prophet for all those who come after him in order to derive an understanding of something. The Muslims' belief is that Islam is till the end of days. Therefore, as we've seen, 1400 years ago, the way we used to live is very different to the way we live now. And I'm assuming will be very different to the way we live another 1,000 years from now, assuming that time continues till then. So therefore, if the Muslims' belief is sound, that Islam will be applicable and is as applicable as it was 1400 years ago, therefore there has to be some level of ijtihad, some level of legal exercising of the minds with the scripture, because this is not separate to the scripture, and taking the context into consideration in determining the fiqh. So let's look at the basis of war. When we look at, for example, where was war instructed within the scripture? Is there anywhere that war was instructed by God? Then we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ. That permission has been granted to those people who have been attacked or who have been killed, بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا, because of the reason that they were oppressed. Indeed, Allah is assisting them. Ala nasrihim laqadir, He's able to assist them. So based on this verse alone, we can see that the default position is that there should be no war, because it wasn't though permission was granted to stop war, permission was granted to wage war. So in reality, and this is where sometimes people say, oh, well, if Islam is a religion of peace, how come there was battles that were fought by the Prophet? Why was there any battles which took place? Surely that having a battle means there's no peace. Islam's default position is of peace. And that's why it says, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ, that permission has been granted on what grounds? So it's not as though it was just left open for the jurists to understand. God in his own wisdom has explained to say, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ. Why? بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا, because they've been oppressed. So we can see that oppression is a key factor, if not the factor, for war to be permitted. So when a group of people oppress another group of people, then permission is granted from a religious perspective. Obviously, we don't all fight wars based on religion, even though some of us may claim to be religiously orientated. Unfortunately, mankind is overcome by greed and overcome by wanting something that does not belong to them, and therefore they will wage war. However, we're speaking specifically here from a religious perspective, that permission is only granted for those people who have been fought against because they've been oppressed, and now they can stand up for themselves. And it goes further to say, الَّذِينَ أُخْرِجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ, those people who've been exiled from their homes without any right. So again, this is being caveated with بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ. So there is, for example, violence or the movement of people permitted under certain grounds, but not when it's بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ. Why were these people? إِلَّا أَن يَقُولُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ. All they said was that our Rabb is Allah. So they made a religious declaration. They made a statement, and if we go back to the Meccan period, they made a statement that they believe in the one God. They believe in Allah as the one God. They wanted to move away from paganism. They wanted to move away from polytheism, and they wanted to follow the one true God. So all they did was make this statement. So this was the freedom of belief. This was the freedom of being able to believe in whoever so you choose. الذين أخرجون من ديارهم بغير حق إلا أن يقولوا ربنا ولولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم ببعض لهدمت صوامع وبيع وصلوات ومساجد. And had it not been for Allah to repel a group of people against others, then you will find that the monasteries, the churches, the synagogues, and the masjids would be destroyed. يذكر فيها اسم الله كثيرا, in which the name of God is mentioned plentiful. ولا ينصرن الله من ينصر, and Allah will assist those who assist him, meaning assist in his way. Inna Allah laqawiyyun aziz, for indeed Allah is all-powerful and almighty. الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور. And Allah describes these people further, that what is their traits. Those people, when they have been allowed to live peacefully and establish themselves upon the earth without the fear of being attacked, what do? أقاموا الصلاة, they establish prayer. وآتوا الزكاة, they give zakah. وَأَمَرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, they enjoin good. وَنَهَوْا عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ, they refrain and prohibit evil. وَلِلَّهِ عَاقِبَةُ الْأُمُورِ, and at the end of the day, the end matter, the conclusion is with Allah. So even though it may be that a people have to go through difficulty, have to go through harm, the end result is with Him. Now, when we go back contextually, we find within the books of fiqh that there is the Darul Islam that is mentioned, and we have others, but we find this classic dichotomy of the world sort of split in Darul Islam and sometimes referred to as Darul Harb or Darul Kufr. Now, this isn't necessarily a position that this is the position that is advocated or one should be adopted. This was a reality. If we go back 1400 or so years, we find out, and even to a certain extent now, it's just that the wars we fight now, as you know, we try to always portray ourselves as the civilized party, and we always try to portray the enemy as the one that is barbaric, even though we're carrying out the same kind of activities, but it's an easy way to deal with it. So the classic dichotomy we have, obviously, is there was us and them, meaning the House of Islam and the other. And that was because the people were always perceiving themselves, generally speaking, as enemies. However, one last contextual setting is that we have forts, towns, and city-states. So therefore, it's important to understand that the way the world was, okay, we didn't have the kind of cities that we have now. On earth, but we have, for example, the cities where you had a fort, a town, or city-states, and that's how they were run, and you had lots of space in between that really was open to anybody and tended not to be managed or policed or had forces controlling. So then we start to see, even within the books of fiqh, various different definitions coming out: Darul Harb, Darul Shirk, Darul Kufr, Darul Sulh, Darul Muwada, Darul Aman, Darul Hudna. And these will be depending on what relationship the other state took with the Muslim state. So when it found that they could live amicably and peacefully, then we had Darul Aman, Darul Hudna, or Darul Muwada, or Darul Sulh. Where we found that there was enmity between the two states, then it was either Darul Shirk or Darul Kufr or Darul Harb, which meant that that country was at war with that particular Muslim state. So these were terms that were being used. The key point that I want to make is the absence of codification. As we saw right from the outset, this is something which has been left to the ijtihad of the ulama. It is the ulama's responsibility to take the principles from the books of fiqh and to take the context into consideration in order to give a particular response. And some may say that this is also the Achilles heel of the religion of Islam, in that it does not have codification. Wouldn't life be so easy if you could just pull a book off the shelf and say that's the answer? But that's not necessarily its Achilles heel. In fact, this is its strength. Why? Because it can actually take into consideration different contexts and give a different answer, even though the situation is exactly the same. The only change is the context. And we find in reality that is the level of, in most even modern legal systems, that taking the context is absolutely essential, even when we see scenarios in sort of, kind of normal case law of murder or something of that nature, where we find that the context means that the judge may give a slightly more lenient punishment than in other circumstances. And that's the key thing here, is the ijtihad of the ulama. It is their responsibility to continue to make Islam relevant to us in whatever century we are in whichever country we are in whichever area we're in. It's their responsibility to continue to do that.
I wonder, could I just ask you?
Sure.
Could you just define the traditional titles of the towns for those who may not know the meanings? Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Shirk.
Yeah. So Darul Harb means war. So for example, if one particular fort or city-state, like for example, Medina, Madinatul Nabi, where the Prophet ﷺ migrated, then that was a city-state. It wasn't a country as such. It was a city-state. It had its own dealings with other cities. It would have agreements, peace treaties, trade agreements, and things of that nature. Mecca, for example, was a city. It was a city-state. It had its own laws. It had its own agreements. So depending on what its relationship it had with those particular countries, it would have that kind of agreement. So if one particular state was at war with another, then it would be Darul Harb. Darul Shirk and Darul Kufr is the particular religious state that state was. So if it professed a particular religion, Shirk is polytheism and Kufr is those that denied Islam. Sulh is having an agreement in place. So these four are pretty much the same. Darul Sulh, Darul Muwada'a, Darul Aman, Darul Hudna. That there was some kind of agreement, a peace agreement between the two states that meant that they would engage, travel across, trade with one another, move from one place to the other. There was basically peace between the two of them and there was no concerns at all. The point of me putting that there is to show why is it that even though, for example, the people were the same and these people were the same, why is it that they had different agreements with these different city-states? And that's where the context comes in. Naturally, if a state takes an aggressive and an attitude that they want to be on a war footing with a particular state, then it's natural for that state to label it as an enemy rather than necessarily label it as a city that is at peace with, or now in the modern world, a country that it's at peace with. Does that make sense, Bob?
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful.
No problem. So if we move to now killing another human with intent, can one human kill another human? So we find here, min ajli dhalika katabna ala Bani Israel. So this speaks particularly about Bani Israel. However, we find many verses which are then applicable to Muslims as well, not just limited to Bani Israel. Annahu man qatala nafsan bighayri nafs. If a person kills a person bighayri nafs, not in retribution for another person, or fasad fil ard. So we're seeing two potential places where a life can be taken. Nafsan bighayri nafs or fasad fil ard. فَكَأَنَّمَا قَتَلَ النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا, as though he has killed the whole of humanity. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. Likewise, if he saves a person, as though he has saved the whole of humanity. وَلَقَدْ جَاءَتْهُمْ رُسُلُنَا بِالْحَقِّ. So then the verse explains, obviously, that the messengers were sent with proof, but many people have decided not to follow. So we find in this verse 2 points being made. Let me just click through. One is nafsan bighayri nafs, which is the hudud punishments, and one is the fasad upon the earth, which is the war that will come to. So if we look at the fasad, there we see that permissibility is granted not only to Muslims but also to Bani Israel from a Quranic perspective, that when a group of people are causing corruption upon the lands, then the religion permits that group of people to wage war. وفي رواية لمسلم أيضا نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الضرب في الوجه وعن الوسم في الوجه. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited from striking the face. So if here we see the Prophet ﷺ prohibiting the striking of the face, is not necessarily going to be permitting the taking of a life. والذين لا يدعون مع الله إلها آخر ولا يقتلون النفس التي حرم الله إلا بالحق ولا يزنون ومن يفعل ذلك يلقى أثاما. So again it mentions, the key point I want you to focus on is ولا يقتلون النفس التي حرم الله إلا بالحق. That they do not kill another human, that which God has prohibited, except due to haqq, except due to a right. So when we speak about these rights, these are the rights, the fasad that we've spoke about, the corruption which is caused upon the earth, where if the good people don't stand up to it, if the people of the earth who stand for good do not stand, then that corruption will become widespread and eventually it will destroy, as we saw earlier, the synagogues, the mosques, the churches and things of that nature, because this corruption will become widespread. So let's look at the Islamic worldview. Obviously, the Muslim worldview is that there should be God's acceptance on his earth. Muslims believe that the earth belongs to Allah. Muslims believe that we are all the creatures of Allah. Muslims believe that we all came from Adam alayhi salatu wasalam, and we are all his children. And therefore, whoever we are, whatever faith we profess, whatever walk of life we are, whatever skin color we are, whatever nationality we are his creatures. Therefore, we must all acknowledge him. Faith in Islam. So one might say, well, why can't we acknowledge him in our own way? Muslims believe that the Quran was the final revealed text. So when the book that was revealed to Moses, then there was a text revealed to Jesus who came after Moses. And then there was a book revealed to Muhammad who came after Jesus and after Moses. The Muslims' view is that Muhammad was sent to all of mankind, not just to Bani Israel. Whereas we find that Moses was sent to Bani Israel. We find that Jesus was also sent to Bani Israel. So Muhammad had an office which was global. Likewise, the Muslims say Muhammad was the last prophet. He is called Khatamun Nabiyyin, the final prophet. There will be no prophet that will come after him, which means that his message is the message which will go till the end of time, because his message kind of is kind of making it slightly mundane, my apologies, but it's like, for example, if a person has written an SOP, a standard operating procedure, and it's now issue number 3, then the people would not be going back to issue number 1 or issue number 2, because they will be going to issue number 3, because issue number 3 is the most up-to-date version. So the Muslims' belief is that the Quran is the final revealed text, and therefore it is the one that should be followed. Muslims also believe that the Quran itself hasn't been changed since Revelation, and therefore it is in its final perfect state, and it is believed to be the only text which is in that form. Hence, this is the reason why the faith in Islam is considered as something which should be at least offered to everybody. And that's the last part, second part, which is the acknowledgement and freedom to choose. La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion. However, people should be at least offered the religion, so they're aware of it. That, oh yes, Islam is X, Islam is Y, Islam is Z. We understand it. However, we choose not to follow it. Thank you very much. That's absolutely fine. However, if there are constraints on the planet or constraints in certain countries, where, for example, we're seeing whether it's the Yin-Yang Muslims in China or whether it's in certain parts of other countries where Muslims aren't freely allowed to express their faith or share their faith, then obviously that becomes problematic. We all know peace on earth. If all of us were us and none of us was them, then, you know, life would be so nice. But, you know, that's how we get unity, is we call all of us us and we don't call anybody them. And finally, you know, live according to God's commands. That is essential. God's commands still are those that should be adhered to on earth. And this is something, the best way to defeat your enemy is to demonstrate how much better things are when you won. For example, the Roman Empire, you know, why did the Roman Empire continue to stay as an empire for as long as it did? Yeah, arguably, why did the British Empire continue to stay for as long as it did? If you can demonstrate to the people you've now conquered that things are a lot better now than they were before, you'd find that people are more willing to accept those circumstances more so than they are if they're not. So sometimes showing the way can only be achieved when you're given authority over people. Sometimes it's more difficult to show a better way of life unless that authority is granted. Like, as I said, we've seen with various empires that didn't fall as quick as maybe they should have fallen as when they conquered. So we're seeing so far the justification of war is remove harm. Okay, the fasad is sometimes referred to, zulm as it's referred to, that needs to be removed. Remove obstacles from the people to invite to Islam. The people, as I said, Muslims' belief is Islam is the final religion. Islam is the completion of God's word to man. God will no longer speak to man ever again. This was the last time that he is going to speak to man, and that he spoke to Muhammad, and he then put all those statements together in which became the Quran. And then separate to that, he had his own words, which were the hadith, and those two documents that were left behind were there so that people could be invited. And we see, for example, slightly long, I'm just going to summarize here, where this type of advice was given to those people that were sent out to various peoples, various cities, various forts, to invite them towards that, to join this fraternity, and they would get the necessary support. This is an interesting point I wanted to share with you that Ibn Taymiyyah makes. He says, قِيلَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُقِيمُ الدَّوْلَةَ الْعَادِلَةَ وَإِنْ كَانَتْ كَافِرَةً وَلَا يُقِيمُ الظَّالِمَةَ وَإِنْ كَانَتْ مُسْلِمَةً وَيُقَالُ الدُّنْيَا تَدُومُ مَعَ الْعَدْلِ وَالْكُفْرِ وَلَا تَدُومُ مَعَ الظُّلْمِ وَالْإِسْلَامِ. That it is said that Allah allows a just state to remain even if it is based on other than Islam. But Allah will not allow the oppressive state to remain, even if it is Muslim-based. Also, it is said that the world will endure with justice and unbelief in Islam, but it will not endure with oppression and Islam. So the key thing that's coming through here is the zulm. That the zulm is the important thing that is the war has been justified to remove. Okay, the zulm, because that is, it is assumed that Islam would remove zulm. But as we can see here, that's not always the case, because we've seen many people use Islam as a means to progress their own views and their own power base, and using Islam as a cloak to work under. When reality, if a person is advocating Islam, then there would be peace in that particular place. There would be no oppression. There would be people allowed to kind of practice their way of life. فهزموهم بإذن الله وقتل داود جالوت وآتاه الله الملك والحكمة وعلمه مما يشاء ولولا دفع الله الناس بعد ببعض لفسدت الأرض. Again, this is the key part that I wanted you to draw your attention to. That had it not been for the ولولا دفع الله الناس, had it not been for the repelling of Allah of the people, some of them against others, لفسدت الأرض. The earth would become corrupt. And we've seen, you know, if we look at now on a global level, when we had, for example, you know, the world has a way of keeping itself in balance. We don't want an absolute superpower on earth, because if you have an absolute superpower on earth, I guess the whole world would have to follow their whims and follow their desires. The fact that we have these kind of various power bases means that the earth is kept, or the people on earth are kept in some balance. And this is what Allah speaks of here. But again, I've been sort of stressing the point that not all battles are religious battles. For example, we have this here, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَهَاجِرُوا وَجَاهَدُوا بِأَمْوَالِهِمْ وَأَنفُسِهِمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالَّذِينَ آوَوا وَنَصَرُوا أُولَٰئِكَ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. So again, mentions here that those people who believe and they emigrate and they fight with their amwal, with their wealth and with themselves in the path of Allah, and those who assist and help, they are awliya'u ba'du ba'd, they are associates of one another. However, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يُهَاجِرُوا, as for those people who believe but they don't emigrate, مَا لَكُم مِّن وَلَايَتِهِمْ مِّن شَيْءٍ, then you have no wilayat, you have no association with them, you are not required to support them, حَتَّى يُهَاجِرُوا, until they emigrate. وَإِنِ اسْتَنْصَرُوكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ, and if they ask you for help religiously, so that means that they may ask you for help based on geographical arrangement, or they may ask for your help because they want to attack another third country, whatever they're asking you for help for. But if they're asking your help based on their religion, فَعَلَيْكُمُ النَّصْرُ, then you can help them, except عَلَىٰ قَوْمٍ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُمْ, if there is a covenant between you and between them, then you cannot. So that means even if a group of Muslims or a Muslim country asks for another group of Muslims in another Muslim country to help them, saying that we're being persecuted because of our religion, then they should be assisted. However, except if there is a covenant or agreement with this third-party country that you have a trade agreement or you have a peace agreement with them, now you cannot violate that peace agreement or that trade agreement with them, even if it means in support of this persecuted community. So you can see that this is not a very simplistic kind of black and white. There is a lot more complications associated with it. Similarly, two groups of Muslims can fight. If two parties of Muslims fight, فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا, then make good between them. Find a way that there can be peace. فَإِنْ بَغَتْ إِحْدَاهُمَا عَلَى الْأُخْرَى, if one group renegades against the other, if it goes against the boundaries of what it should do against the other, فَقَاتِلُوا الَّتِي تَبْغِي, then fight the one which has gone against the boundaries that have been set. حَتَّى تَفِيءَ إِلَىٰ أَمْرِ اللَّهِ فَإِنْ فَعَلْ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا بِالْعَدْلِ وَأَقْسِطُوا, then if they do good, then be just. بِالْعَدْلِ وَأَقْسِطُوا, so that means be fair and be just. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُقْسِطِينَ, for indeed Allah loves those who are just and fair. So this is always about bringing. So here, this particular verse speaks about two parties, Muslim groups that are fighting against one another. So it says, you go in as an arbiter, try to find some peaceful resolution. If it doesn't look like there's a peaceful resolution and one party is adamant on fighting the other party and is actually the aggressor and is transgressing things, then you should join that party and put these people, put this kind of upheaval down. And however, if they refrain, if they turn away from that, then be fair and just with them. For indeed, Allah loves those people who are just. What about non-combatants? So we're accepting now that there are wars which take place. War is, unfortunately, fighting is human nature. It exists. There were some religious grounds by which God had permitted fighting. We saw that in the first few verses. But there's also fighting which is going to happen. We've seen, for example, those two groups of Muslims are fighting. Well, they're clearly not fighting based on religious grounds. They must be fighting over water or resources or land or whatever else they're fighting over. It's clearly not a religious battle. So that shows that human nature is that when things get beyond conversation, beyond having a talk, it's going to go to arms. It's going to go to battle. And that happens. So what if that happens? What is supposed to happen now? We're in this situation. So the Prophet ﷺ says, Amara Rasulullah Zayd ibn Haritha. The Prophet put Zayd ibn Haritha in charge of a particular battalion that was sent out. And he's mentioned, and he gives an order that if such and such is killed, then he should lead. And if such and such is killed, he should lead. And such is killed, he should lead. And the reason for this was that Haris ibn Umair had been killed by the Ghassanids. He was sent as a messenger to call people towards Islam. In fact, they killed the messenger. So obviously they then went. Then the Prophet then sent this battalion. Again, they were asked to join. They refused. The war started. But then the Prophet set certain rules. La taghduru wa la taghlu. Don't go beyond the kind of, don't deceive. Don't go beyond. Don't kill a child. Don't kill a woman. Don't kill an elderly gentleman. Don't kill those people who have dedicated themselves to monasteries or synagogues or places of religion. Don't cut down trees. Don't cut down, don't break buildings. So therefore, even though there were certain circumstances where war was permitted by the Prophet, he gave them rules associated with it, that this is what you do. So, this was a kind of an acceptance. This is, in this case here, where a messenger was killed. And therefore, it was quite clear that this group of people weren't going to just sit down and have a nice conversation or a peaceful conversation. They had taken a stance of aggression against the Muslim party. So the Prophet gave permission for them to do so. However, he gave them rules as to what they can and can't do in terms of engaging with the enemy. However, you find in Quduri, which was written around 973-1037, that so it says you can use catapults, and we know catapults are generally impermissible. The reason why catapults are generally impermissible is because they're indiscriminate, and a Muslim cannot kill anybody that's a child or a woman or whatever. So how can you use a majaniq, which is literally firing a catapult, a rock, over a wall? You don't know who's going to be on the other side. وَحَرِّقُوهُمْ, and even permitted firing oil on these catapults. And generally speaking, the Prophet ﷺ forbade the use of fire as a weapon. For he said that's only God uses that. وَأَرْسَلُوا عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَاءَ and cut down their trees and also destroy their crops. So the question comes, we have the Prophet on the one hand saying that, and within several centuries after, we have here quite clearly completely opposite, that you can use indiscriminate weaponry, you can use fire, you can cut down trees, you can destroy crops, and it mentions this as to why that was the reason, but we'll get more to that as we move on. So in conclusion, as we are literally a minute over what I said we would do, so my apologies there, Bob, hopefully we'll be finished in the next few minutes. Oppression is the key, okay? Oppression is one of the reasons why religious war, if we can use that phrase, was permitted, or war was permitted within religion. We have to bear in mind that Islam came to manage all human activity, whatever it might be, whether it's answering the call of nature, whether it's buying some food, whether it's marriage, whether it's war. These are all human activities and they exist. So therefore, Islam came to manage them rather than to absolutely replace them, because in certain circumstances, as we've seen, there is a need for war. And this oppression can be either against the self or the other, as we've seen so far. And as we mentioned, this peace on earth, And I don't know why this has gone in the reverse order, but let me just bring all the slides up. And we see, in Allah ya'muru bil adl, indeed Allah orders you to be just, wal ihsan, to be fair, wa ita'i dhil qurba, to give to your close kin, and He prohibits you from fahsha, wal munkar wa baghi, transgression, evil. Ya'idhukum la'alakum, He reminds you in order that you may take admonition, and fulfill bi ahdillah, fulfill your contractual obligations, either ahadtum, when you make them. وَلَا تَنْقُضُوا الْأَيْمَانَ, don't break your contractual obligations after you have affirmed them. And you have made Allah as your guarantor. Indeed, Allah knows what you are doing. So this is now about contractual obligations. So if you remember, Bob, you stopped me very early on and said it'd be nice if you kind of explained what these Darul Harb, Darul Hudna, and all these various things mean. So this was that we know, for example, that the Muslims' primary default position was one of peace. So if that country was also of peace, then obviously there would be a contractual agreement between the two parties, there would be a trade agreements, they would be at peace. However, those countries that took a position of offense, or those countries that, or those states rather, that weren't working, then there was war. But so this is about the contractual obligations that the Muslims needed to adhere to, even if it meant not supporting a persecuted Muslim minority that were living within that particular city-state. If there was an agreement between the Muslim city-state and that particular non-Muslim city-state that they were at peace and they were persecuting their own people, then obviously they were told to refrain from that. I'm not going to go through all those verses. You get an idea of the point that I'm trying to make, because obviously I'm conscious of time. Qisas we've seen, and this is a key part of Islam, which answers the question, why did the scholars permit catapults? Why did the scholars permit fighting with fire? Why did the scholars permit the chopping down of trees? Why did the scholars permit the destroying of crops, when it goes completely opposite to what the Prophet said? So the Prophet is saying one thing and the scholars are saying another. How can that be right? Okay, how can that even make sense? Are they following Islam? Are they not following Islam? And hence the reason why right from the outset, and I know there might be a lot to take on, so my apologies for that, but right on the outset, we talked about text and context. So what the Muslim city-states were finding is that the enemy were firing catapults, the enemy were firing fire, the enemy were chopping down trees, the enemy were destroying crops. So therefore, in Qisas, which is the law of retribution, the Muslims were permitted through the law of retribution to carry out similar acts. And this is where they get the law of retribution from. So nuclear weapons, for example, there's Pakistan, which is Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which is established on Islamic principles, that has nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons are, one, indiscriminate, and secondly, they use fire, two principles which go against the fundamentals of what the Prophet said. But when we explore the rationale for why Pakistan went ahead with nuclear weapons, is because their main foe on their doorstep, India, has nuclear weapons. So this becomes again under the law of retribution, that if our enemy has them, then we need to have them as well. So even though principally it goes against what the Prophet spoke about, from a perspective of retribution, it means obviously there's that balance. And if you remember the verse of the Quran which said, وَلَوْلَا دَفْءُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ, that if God did not kind of balance one group of people with another group of people, there would be corruption upon the earth. So if India was all powerful, then why would it stop at, not taking the whole of Kashmir? Why would it not stop at taking Pakistan? Maybe the fear of nuclear weapons is keeping it in check. Likewise, Indians could say the same. So sometimes having that balance on earth means that people don't press that button, means that we don't go into an all-out war when there is the fear that the enemy has the same weapon that we have. So some conclusions before we finish. There is an absence of absolute codification which exists within Islam. If the fiqh is a product of its context, and as we've seen the actions of certain scholars which are completely in contradistinction with the words of the Prophet, yet they are valid legally because of the fact that the context was taken into consideration. Underlying principles, inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsani wa ita'i dhil qurba. So this is the underlying principle. Commands justice, kindness, grace, caring to those who are close, prohibits indecency, wickedness, and aggression. These are the fundamental sort of principles. So oppression was the underlying factor which the war was permitted from a religious perspective. How is war engaged? Treaties and agreements, whatever the Muslim city-state agreed with the other party, that's how they engaged. And Allah informed and ordered the Muslims to adhere to their treaties and agreements. And then we have two options. One is pardon, which is a get better of the two, that if somebody transgresses against you, you forgive them, you pardon them, but it permitted the retributive justice as well. And I think that brings us to the end. About 6-7 minutes gone over, so my apologies, but I will stop the share.
Please don't apologize. Thank you for giving us such a comprehensive overview in such a short time, from Quran to the latest sources of this complex subject. It's so easy for us to adopt an absolutist approach, you know, thou shalt not kill in the 10 Commandments, and the Quranic verse that you quoted, if you kill one person, it's as if you destroyed humanity, which we have in Judaism too. But when you come down to it, and in real life, they say the devil is in the detail. Originally, it was a French, le Dieu est dans le détail. God is in the detail. So whichever way you look at it, when it comes to war, there are two sides to it. And I'm sure there are lots of questions in people's minds. We had one in particular, which in some sense you touched upon, Mufti Amjad, why there is conflict between Muslims, Sunni and Shia, I think was probably in there, which to some extent you dealt with groups against each other. But I'm wondering if to start off our question and answer, if you'd like to address that one first, which was from Alex Lipkin, and then we'll go into general Q&A.
Sure. So with the Shia Sunni, this goes back to, you know, it's a theological difference which started off originally as a political difference. We saw, for example, where the basis is of the killing of Hussein, who is the grandson of the Prophet, and he was killed. And as a result, once he was killed, there was obviously a group who felt, even before that, which was just an opinion, that Ali, who was the cousin and also the son-in-law of the Prophet, he should have been given the Khilafah, the Khalif, the leader of the believers, the Amir al-Mu'mineen. Instead, it was given to Abu Bakr. So some views had it that it should have been handed from sort of, no son lived of the Prophet, so it should have been handed to the nearest male relative, pretty much like the way kingdoms were. But obviously, Islam was not based on kingdoms. Islam was based on who is the best person for that job. So those opinions existed. But once, obviously, Hussein was martyred, as he was, in Karbala, then we saw this division come. And then when we start to see the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Fatimids and the Alids, and we start to see these various dynasties coming up, because there's never been, apart from the 30 years that the Prophet ﷺ lived, and then following him, I think it was about 30 years of the 4 Khalifs, there has always been division within the Muslim world. There's never been a monolithic group of people all adhering to one leader. You saw, for example, at one time, 3 Khalifs which existed, having their own names on various coins. So that has existed. So it's the usual thing. Very rarely are the battles waged on religious perspectives in the sense of we're going to bring these people towards the right. It was more either political differences or, for example, looking at empire building, or, for example, resources. And that is our human activity. You know, as humans, one thing we found is, like we saw with the 2 sons of Adam, is we have an innate, unfortunately, we have an innate desire to go to violence in order to get what we want, and we sometimes do not stop. And after World War II, when the UN came into fruition, we all thought that the UN would stop all wars. But here we are, 70 odd years after the UN has come in, and there's probably been more wars after the UN has been formed than probably before. The only difference is they've not been in Europe. We've just moved the battleground to the Middle East or to Asia. rather than from the European ground. So, you know, we unfortunately have that habit. You know, when does your greed stop? You know, we'll see, for example, right now we're seeing in the Western world where, you know, it's advancing its views and beliefs far beyond its borders, because it feels that that is the best way that people should live. So there are always going to be our views which we want to push on other people, and if they don't accept, then it unfortunately is going to lead to war. So very rarely religious wars. They may still be with the Sunni Shia, that can quite easily be a religious war without any doubt, but they tend to be, as we said, just groups that are fighting that happen to be Muslim.
Thank you. So I don't know if people would like to raise their hands or put a signal electronically on the screen, and we'll be able to let you have your question. Might be easier than the chat. Professor Alexander, Philip Alexander.
Yes, thank you very much, Mufti. I find that very, very interesting and instructive. Could I ask just two questions? You mentioned the 4 schools of Islam, the 4 great recognized schools. What I'm not clear about is, do they each have their own doctrine of war? Or is there some sort of common doctrine of war? So that's the first question. Would there be a Hanbali doctrine of war? Would there be a Maliki doctrine of war? And if so, you know, what would the elements of difference between them? But the other question would be one that I think a lot of outsiders would naturally come to them, non-Muslims, is where does the concept of jihad fit into all this? Is it part of the doctrine of war in Islam, or, you know, what's the place of that concept in the Islamic doctrine of war?
So in terms of the first question with regards to the doctrine of war and the 4 schools, the difference that the 4 schools have is in their legal theory, their legal philosophy. So what they base, how do they develop law? So, for example, the Hanafi, obviously all will take the Quran. So they all take the Quran, they all take the Hadith. However, they may take certain Hadith and not take other Hadith, because each Hadith is graded. So they may find that a particular narrator they don't hold in high value, and therefore they discount the Hadith, and instead they hold this other particular Hadith. So you'll find that even though the verses of the Quran will all be the same, the Hadith will vary. That's the second. That's the first thing. The second thing is then they have a different linguistic and kind of understanding of what words mean in the Quran. Some words are quite clear, sarih, and some are slightly obscure. So when it comes to obscure words, it's now trying to understand what do those obscure words mean. So depending on the particular legal philosophy and legal theory that particular jurist has developed, then he will take a different understanding from those particular verses. So you'll find slight variation. Generally speaking, you find broad similarities. So we find, for example, in prayer, in zakah, in all acts, even in the doctrine of war, there will be similarities. It's only in some particular areas there will be slight differences. So it's not as though there will be vast differences between the schools. In terms of the concept of jihad, the concept of jihad exists. We've seen, for example, when I explained earlier that the Muslims were encouraged and also directed quite clearly that people are given a choice of understanding the Islam, that people have a free opportunity to choose whether they wish to adopt Islam or not. So therefore, Muslims were encouraged, we can clearly see from the verses, to go out and propagate that. Whether that meant if you came across an enemy that said, no, we're not interested in your religion whatsoever, we don't want our people to know, because we have to understand, this is the context that I wanted to bring, is the way, for example, city-states worked and forts worked. So historically speaking, you know, citizenship is a new thing. So what people did was you joined a fort where you felt the person in charge, the baron, the whoever he was, and his army could protect you. So you went and you lived in that area, and you inhabited that particular fort or that particular area. So when it came to new ideas or new concepts, then it wasn't as though you had a choice. It would be based upon the Baron opening up his drawbridge, or whoever was in charge allowing that to happen. So therefore, jihad was instructed and encouraged on Muslims in order for that Islam's message to spread, so people would become aware of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was a blanket sort of statement as what you're seeing now, in terms of if for example, the Muslim community came against a group of people and they found that actually sitting down and talking to them got that same result, then it wouldn't necessarily mean that they would say, okay, let's, break the doors down, because that's the only way we're going to get our message across. So the key thing was removal of oppression and ensuring that the message of Islam was heard by the people, so they had a free choice to decide whether they wish to follow that religion or not.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Looking for hands up. Unless you want to put in the chat. Happy to welcome Muhammad Ullah, chaplain of the universities in Manchester. A very busy man, and great to have you with us.
When there's not that many questions, Bob, it's one of two things. One is it was an excellent presentation, or two, everybody's fallen asleep.
I do see Dr. Dwight Swanson has, you have your hand up. Can I ask you to unmute? Dwight?
Yes, I was frantically looking for how to raise my hand, and I can't find it on my, it's changed where, anyway, never mind.
You're usually the one who advises me on technology.
Well, that's meager difference. Yes, it helped in so many ways. I think the things that have struck me particularly in some ways is the, I mean, a phrase I really liked was the all us and no them, which is something which I would think, which I carry with me in our own church situation, is or people around it. It's not us and them, it's us and us. And so that's a good thing, I think, to keep in mind. The people that we may differ with are still us in some ways. I guess the question is related to what we've been trying to do in the series, consider the actual situation of the war in Ukraine. But in light of what you've been saying, obviously the question is not how do Muslims view that war, or particularly, but that you, where is it? The distinction between a war that is because of religious reasons and the non-religious wars, in which ostensibly one could say what we found in the earlier sessions, that what looks particularly from the outside like a war of either aggression or a war of seeking to extend boundaries, which is essentially, I would say, a non-religious war, but that the religion has either played a central part or has been caught up into it, so that in the eyes of leaders and people, it is viewed as a holy war, even though it's against another Christian state. So that raises the time-old question, how do you know it's a religious war, and how do you know it's not just a land grab or something like that?
Yeah, I'm glad you've raised that, because what we tend to find is that sometimes normal wars, if we could use that phrase, are dressed up as religious wars, or they're done, or they are intentionally dressed up in order to drum up support for them. So you may find, for example, in the Ukraine and Russian war, that in order to recruit more soldiers, then it might be pushed as a religious war on both sides in order to get more people involved. Because at the end of the day, it's trying to promise people heaven, that this is something that is God ordained, that this is something that you will get rewarded for. It's not just something you're doing for the sake of bravery or anything of that nature. So it is a difficult distinction to draw. I want to sort of bring your mind back, or cast your mind back to a few of the earlier slides where I spoke of the ijtihad of the scholar. So in reality, that it cannot be decided by politicians. Even when we had the earlier empires, they were still under the jurisdiction of the Sharia, even though the Khalifs were non-Sharia experts, even though they were living like kings. They were doing pretty much everything that they were forbidden to do anyway. So therefore, the scholars, that's why you find the legal schools developed separately from the political systems. So you find the Hanafi legal school, the madaris, the madrasas, they developed, on a separate level. And in fact, we saw the Khalifs punishing many of the founding members of the schools because they didn't toe the line. They didn't justify their extravagances. They didn't justify their actions. So they imprisoned them, and in some cases killed them. So that will exist. It is whether God wishes to guide those particular scholars in that particular place to issue an edict to say, this is actually a religious war. And therefore, in you engaging in this war will get you reward. Because the difference really from a religious war and a non-religious war is that in a religious war, you're aiming to get something in the next life. You're aiming to be rewarded for it. You expect God to be happy from you. Whereas in a non-religious, it's just a practical day-to-day kind of activity. So, so it really depends on the ijtihad of the ulama, and whether the ulama are independent from the state or dependent upon the state. We've seen, for example, without naming particular Muslim countries, we've seen the leadership within Muslim countries imprisoning certain scholars because of a particular stance that they're taking. So that unfortunate dynamic is going to exist, and I think that will exist for as long as we're on the surface of this earth, that people will try to promote it and pitch it in a certain way in order to recruit more people, in order to justify certain actions that they may choose to do. How do we as people outside of that, I guess, once we have an agreement, for example, say, a person is living in country X, and country X says we're going to war, and you have a sort of we've talked about mu'ahada, we've talked about this contractual obligation, and you are contractually obliged because they're now kind of recruiting people for war. You are contractually obliged, so your contractual obligation now tells you that you must go for war. So it really depends how you end up in that situation, and whether it is considered as something you will get rewarded for, or something you will not get rewarded for, something you'll get punished for. Because in reality, when we speak of religion, that's really what is in the mind of a follower, is that, is God pleased with me, or is God angry with me if I do this or I don't do this?
You certainly get people thinking. More thoughts than questions so far.
Can I come in and ask something there?
Rabbi Warren Elf.
Thanks. Thank you, Mufti Amjad. That's fascinating, erudite, and stimulating and challenging, I think, all at the same time. What you were saying there about sort of, what's, I suppose it's what God wants and expects, and what's going to be merit-worthy for us. But are there times, though, that perhaps the decision has to be made without thinking that through? And I'm thinking of, you were talking about Russia and Ukraine, you know, so sometimes, you know, self-defense, you know, how far do you let it go before you respond? And if it's not self-defense directly, if there is an abuse that is going on, or abuse of power that's going on, or a people or group of people are being oppressed, at what stage do we turn around and say, enough's enough, we have to do something? Yeah, so how does it fit in terms of these situations?
No, really appreciate that that comment and that question, because it's really the balance of the better. You know, we don't live in a black and white world. We live in lots of grays, and it's trying to get that balance right. And obviously, one of the key factors of permitting war, as we saw from the verse of the Quran, was to remove oppression. So, you know, but also it's got to be done in such a way that you have capacity. So it doesn't warrant a group of people that are ill-equipped, poorly trained, to go up against an enemy that is going to annihilate them, because that's just suicide, and that's not something which God would instruct a group of people to do. So this is where the ijtihad comes in. This is where you have this council of scholars. This is where you have these, literally have these conversations that we're having right now, these type of deliberations, these, you know, and really once these deliberations and these discussions are had, then I guess it's this collective, and this is where ijma comes in, which is a concept that exists within kind of the legal theory that we spoke about with the professor, that, you know, we have Quran, we have hadith, and then there's ijma. Ijma is where consensus is built. So once consensus is built, so once the scholars, you know, weigh up everything and say, really, this is a time where we have to act. This is a time where we cannot sit still, and it's, you know, it's everything is weighed up. Then that fatwa, that decision that's made by that council, is then issued. Then it depends what kind of clout and following that council has. That if it has those people, because, you know, there are so many councils now, because of the lack of the kind of hierarchy that exists within Islam, there is no group of people that speaks for all the Muslims. There's no group of people, apart from obviously if the state sets them, say, for example, in Saudi Arabia or in Pakistan or in Iran, there's an actual collective group of people that have those conversations. Really, it's up to the people then to say, you know, we adhere to this fatwa, we're going to act upon it. So it's not that black and white. There's a lot of conversations that need to be had there. And, you know, you would bring in experts, you know, war experts. You won't just be a group of scholars, because you're looking at from the legality side of it, but you would need opinions from experts in the field as to the outcomes from this particular war, from this particular battle, success rates, you know, the whole kind of strategy behind it. As I said, we sometimes oversimplify things and sort of say, you know, in Islam it says X, or in Judaism it says Y, and that's it. There's a lot more that needs to be taken into consideration. So yeah, it would literally be those conversations, Rabbi, that you would have, and you would come to some kind of consensus. It may not be an absolute consensus. There may still be dissenting voices, but once there's been some kind of a large percentage that have agreed upon it, whatever the quorum is, whatever the agreement is, then everybody would support it. There would be no dissenting voices after. And that's something, again, which is an injunction from the Sharia, that yes, you can express an opinion, you can say what you feel. However, once the conclusion is reached, then you must all show one face. You must all stick to it.
Thank you. I think there's always a tendency to oversimplify things. It's good to hear the thorough methodology of that. So thank you.
There was a question in the chat for you, Mufti Amjad, from Alex Lipkin. Does the Mufti have a view on peace in Israel and also the wider Middle East?
Goodness me, do you have 6 months? Well, I don't think there's anybody here who would not want peace in Israel. I thought peace in Palestine, peace in that part of the world, peace in the Middle East. I think everybody would want peace. I mentioned to you right from the outset that as the directive is initially, that the default position is of peace. What does that peace mean? What would it look like? You know, there's been conversations that I've been having, you know, the two-state theory, the one-state theory, what would work, what wouldn't work, how would, you know, no, I'm sure anybody in their right mind cannot sit here and say that the current situation is a sound situation. It's an acceptable situation. As humans watching what we're watching is absolutely unacceptable. There are obviously clearly violations of UN agreements, as we spoke about the UN when I mentioned earlier, where, you know, there's been unaccepting of these kind of intranational systems that we have. So that needs to be looked at. So I cannot give a 10-second snippet answer, but the answer basically is there should be peace. Absolutely, there should be peace. And the key thing is that we need to see, you know, how we can sit here and watch people being abused and treated and live the way they do. You know, it's very uncomfortable to see that. But as people with intellect, people with wisdom, people with influence, that is our job to remove that difficulty that the people are facing, whether it's in that part of the world, in the Middle East, or whether it's anywhere on the planet.
Thank you.
Is there any other world problems that I can solve for you? Just add it to the list.
I think the sense of humor is a wonderful ingredient for peace.
Eid problem. That's one thing that's even beyond my remit. I cannot solve the Eid problem. I can bring peace to the Middle East, but I can't solve the Eid problem.
So I see Jackie Hurst has got a question for you here.
Thanks very much, Ruben. It might be a very naive question, but in the context of what you've just said about Israel-Palestine, it's a question about context, really. I'm struggling to know, apart from in Saudi or Pakistan or Iran, where the ijma for a particular action or course of action could be located and decided.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question, which leads to this whole concept of this monolithic Muslim world. We know, for example, that Egypt entered into peace negotiations and had a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which enraged other parts of the Middle East, saying that, well, what's going on here, you know? So each state is going to look after its own. Each state has to look at what is on our border. So Egypt is saying, well, hold on a second here. It's okay for you being, you know, thousands of miles away over there. This is a border we share. So there will be a ijma within each country as it stands at the moment. If that country decides to take religious direction. So Egypt may decide that it's a secular country. It doesn't take religion into its decision whatsoever, whether in its legal decisions or in its political decisions. I guess Egypt can do that. It's a sovereign state. It can do literally what it likes. Similarly, Pakistan might decide that it wants to take a completely different position. Again, Pakistan's, you know, miles away from the borders of Israel, so therefore it can choose. So really, there's no, you know, monolithic ijma or group of ulama that can decide what happens in the world because they don't have jurisdiction. Once we had nation states, that kind of monolithic kind of empire type mindset disappeared. Each nation state is a sovereign state, and it will decide what works for it. Whether it takes religious direction or not, that's its decision. Whether, you know, a country decides to become more secular or less secular, or have religion in its mantra or not have religion in its mantra, that's its decision. So, you know, I don't think you will have this kind of collective view. So you will get different views from different parts of the world.
Basically, the nation state trumps.
Pretty much so, yeah, pretty much so. Yeah.
The political agent, in fact, is the one with control over.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the people that have power over the guns that have power. You know, it's the one who have power over military. It's the people who have power who can exercise force. That in reality is whoever can exercise force, they are in charge. So whatever the political power is, and it tends to be, even though in some cases superficially democratic, if we're looking at the Middle East, some cases it can be dictatorships, in some cases it can be whatever. So whoever's decided whatever method that has been used for that particular individual or those group of individuals to be in charge of that country, they then decide what works for them. Either they're taking their people's needs into consideration or they're not taking their people's needs into consideration. That's just how that country decides to run. So it will, yes, nation states. And that's not alien, because as I mentioned, you know, pretty much after when we saw, for example, with Sayyidina Ali, we saw that we had an Umayyad dynasty pretty much forming in Sham, in the Syrian area, separate to what was forming in around Mecca and Medina. So we had two states then. And then you start to see 3, 4, 5, 6. So we had many Islamic empires. Sometimes they were enemies to each other. And therefore, those that were closer to the Mediterranean, they had links with the Europeans. So they may have had different relationships with Christians. Those that were more inland, Iraq, Iran, may have had very different relationship towards Christians because of the interactions, those that were traveling to Bethlehem and Jerusalem from Europe. Therefore, you know, so each kind of, and this is where the professor mentioned in terms of the madhahibs, you know, you saw this different flavor, this geographical development, contextual development as well. Similarly, for example, you know, can you eat prawns, or are prawns fish or not fish? So you find those madhabs that were developing in landlocked areas tended not to look very kindly towards prawn as fish, but those that were more closer to the sea were more open to seeing prawn as fish. So some permitted it and some didn't permit it. So you see these contextual variations, but really it's the political clout. Whoever has the political clout, they decide what system, what legal system they use, and in terms of what relationships work for them.
So, sorry, Bob, but there are other people who, I just wanted to press this a little bit. So if there were a situation in India, for example, where the ulama were consulted, is it likely that you would get a difference in consensus between, say, Deobandi and Barelvi scholars? And how would that then interact with the political agents of the Indian state, which is obviously an extraordinarily complex and fiery question?
Yeah, I guess because if you look at it, say, from a minority perspective, then, you know, even here, say in the UK, you know, Muslims are a minority as they are in India as a minority. So depending on what the particular topic is, whether it's trying to side up to the government or whatever it is. But if it's a case of trying to find something which is for the betterment of the Muslim community, then we saw, for example, during COVID, we found people from various factions within the Muslims, whether they were Deobandi, whether they were Barelvi, whether they were Ahl al-Hadith, whether they were, whatever they were, Shia, all came together in order to agree certain protocols of how masjid should operate during COVID, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. And there was a sort of a collective response. I guess when it's in times of peace that people start becoming separate, it's when you need to kind of club together because there's a common enemy, then you'll find that we will all come together. But as soon as there's no common enemy, then we sort of start infighting, possibly. So I don't think, you know, if there was a particular matter that was taking place in India and the government was seeking the scholars or the Muslim scholars' view for some reason, I cannot see them, if it was something that would affect the Muslims generally, there being a different view. But I guess we would have to see, you know, the proof is in the pudding, as they say.
Yeah, I was thinking more in the context of violence and conflict.
Oh, you mean, would there be a difference between the two parties? Maybe, possibly. It just depends what the context, what the underlying principles are. As we mentioned, you know, it depends what the legal philosophy that's being used. It depends what the objective is. It depends what the aim is. So, for example, if it was saying that, so let's just take India, for example. I've not seen a fatwa from the Barelvi community or from the Deobandi community saying that India is Darul Harb. That would be a politically sensitive fatwa to issue. In fact, both have said it's Darul Aman, where, you know, there's lots of stuff that's still coming out from India where minorities are being targeted, mosques are being razed to the ground. Yet I've not seen a difference from my reading, and I have connections with that part of the world, with my reading, that there's been a different sort of a legal position adopted towards the state depending on the type of schools, modern schools that exist within the Indian subcontinent.
Thank you. Further questions? We're coming up to our half-past mark here, but maybe there are still things you want to ask. Oh, I do see there's a question on chat, if I can find it. This is from Gohan, a direct question to me, which may I read it out, Gohan, or would you like to ask it? Okay, I'll read. I don't know if you are still there. Yes, I'll read it out for you, if I may. This is addressed to our speaker. You said Islam manages all aspects of life, but within war, were there any rules regarding prisoners, or did the Islamic Prophet order to take no prisoners?
That will vary again based on context. So there are occasions when prisoners are not taken. There are occasions when prisoners are taken. There are occasions when prisoners are exchanged. As we saw very early on, there is clear instructions from the Prophet that you cannot indiscriminately kill and you cannot use fire to kill. And we saw, for example, in Qūḍī, a Hanafi text, where it clearly said that you can use catapults and you can raise trees to the ground, yet the hadith was quite clear that do not attack, don't destroy trees, don't destroy livestock, don't destroy land. So when you start scratching your head thinking, well, here's the Prophet saying one thing, and here's something quite the opposite going on. How is it that they're adhering to the same message? And this is the key thing about understanding the context. So where, for example, you're engaging with, say, there is a UN convention that prisoners must be treated in A, B, C, D way, and a Muslim state signs up to that UN convention, then mu'ahada, they have made a contractual obligation. They now have to adhere to that contractual obligation. So they will fulfill their contractual obligation. So to understand, it's not as simple to try to understand, and this is why it's left to the ulama that will contemplate and assess and analyze and find out what is the best for themselves. Just to, sorry, I didn't catch the lady's name that asked the question with regards to the state and how it behaves if there was multiple states. And the state will take its own benefits first, naturally, because it is making sure that it and its people survive, are in a good position. So similarly, wherever this agreement is, whether it's a prisoner exchange or not or whatever, then that state will see and engage with that other state as it sees fit. As I said, we have now obviously UN conventions that countries have to sign up to and agree to and adhere to. And in order to fulfill, and that's why there are certain issues when we find certain countries don't do that, then this kind of charge of hypocrisy comes in. Now, hold on a second here. Everybody else has to adhere to these conventions. Why don't you need to adhere to these conventions? So when we saw reports of these black off-site torture and things of that nature, it becomes somewhat hypocritical and arrogant for certain countries to say, you cannot do this, but we can. And that then we start to break the laws of justice and fairness and honesty and things of that nature. So hence the reason why when it comes to prisoners, there has to be that equality, that we cannot do this to your prisoners. Would you agree that you're not going to do that to our prisoners? Yes, yes, fine, shake on it. That's it, it's done. It's now a contractual obligation.
We're now at 5:30, and on behalf of everyone, I want to formally thank our presenter Mufti Amjad Mohammed for a very stimulating talk and being in the hot seat as well for our questions. And we're not quite finished yet. I want to thank everybody who's participated in the discussion so far. And as I say, we're not quite finished because it's our tradition, dating from the time when we actually used to meet in person at the university, not to all depart when the session was over, but to linger and to chat with each other and with the presenter. So we've taken that forward into Zoom, the Zoom world. And so there will be another 15 minutes of opportunity for that purpose. And I see one or two hands were up already, so you can still keep talking. If you need to go, then please feel free. And if you'd like to stay, also feel free. We've come to the end of our series, but you know, war isn't going to go away anytime soon. Certainly not in Ukraine by the looks of things. Of course, one lives in hope, obviously. But it may well be that we want to continue with this subject. So if you feel that there is a way forward in that respect, through the three faiths, three Abrahamic faiths or wider, then please say. Or we could also take a secular approach to the subject. We've got some thanks from Jackie Hurst to our speaker, and also from Usman, saying what an excellent presentation it was. But now you've got a chance actually to chat more informally before we finally depart. So once again, Mufti Amjad, thank you so much. And it's good that you've agreed on behalf of your family to stay for a little bit longer, so people can unmute and talk as you please now. Also wishing you Eid Mubarak from Rabbi Warren Elf. This is where you get the peace.
The quiet after the storm, not before.
Yeah.
Hello there, Mufti.
I am.
I just was, on a lighter note, was just wondering what you feel the Islamic position is on music, especially classical music, but music on the whole.
Music, if we look at the whole general concept of Islam in the sense of what its purpose is. So Islam's purpose is to remind one of one's responsibility on this earth. That what have you come for? What is your purpose in life? What, you know, where were you? So the Muslims' view is that the souls were created first. And when the souls were created, they were sent down to earth into the human body, blown into the mother's womb after about sort of 4 months, rather 120 days. And then they go through earth. And as they go through their life, they've got to constantly remind themselves of returning back to God. So we have this phrase, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Indeed, we are from Allah, and to Allah is our return. So anything which reminds us of Allah, anything which reminds us of Allah, anything which reminds us of this destiny, this trip that we're going on, then we are encouraged to engage with. What generally speaking is found with regards to music is that music tends not to remind one. It tends to kind of preoccupy one with their own kind of sort of detachment from reminding oneself. So that's usually why it's frowned upon in that sense, because of the fact that it's not reminded. So, you know, the alternative is given as melodiously reciting of the Quran. So the human voice. So the human voice is something, especially when it's singing nasheed, or especially when it's reciting the Quran, or hymning the praises of God, or praising the Prophet, things of that nature. So then what they're doing is they're reminding you of Allah, or reminding you of the Prophet. This is something which is instrumental in literally every aspect of the Muslim's life, is they're constantly supposed to remind themselves of this trip, that they're returning, that this life is short, that this life is only, you are only a wayfarer, you are only a traveler. In fact, that's mentioned in hadith, that you don't live here. This is not your earth. This is just a path that you're crossing. Your home is Jannah. Your abode is heaven. because the Muslims' belief is that the soul itself is created, but it's never destroyed. So this is an unusual creation. Most creations will be destroyed. The human soul is rare in that it is created but never destroyed. It will live for eternity. So therefore, anything which is reminding the human of God, anything which is reminding the human of the hereafter is a good thing. Anything which is making him forget, whether it's watching, even a football game for hours and hours and hours, or whatever it might be, anything which is turning him away from that, that is not considered as a good thing, because it's detracting him from his journey or her journey back to God, back to Allah. And so that's why always you'll find, for example, especially young people, they'll recite the Quran melodiously. I would try my best, but my voice is very croaky and I'm an old man. So I would, it's not good. Everybody would quickly switch off and go. So, if somebody had a sweeter voice than me, somebody was much younger than me, and they recite the Quran. Many people say when they go to, say, Morocco for holidays or go somewhere to a Muslim country and they hear the adhan the first time, they find it very peaceful. They find it very spiritual. So these are the sorts of music, if I can use that phrase, that is encouraged. That is so that people are kind of connecting with God, being reminded of God, rather than something which is kind of human-made, which is more pushing a person away from that kind of spiritual enlightenment and spiritual reflection and spiritual understanding.
And so it's a very good subject, and it reminds me that that music can be an instrument, literally, for peace, as in Daniel Barenboim's East-West Divan Orchestra, which brings together Israelis, Palestinians, Iranians, Egyptians, Syrians, and the attention behind that is to create a community of people who politically may be at odds with each other, but music is a unifying factor. How are we doing for time? Oh, we've still got more time. I saw some hands up before we got to the 1/2 mark. We could just simply bid each other farewell, shalom, salam, peace be upon you.
I just will say my thanks for that and hope that we can continue the drawing on your wisdom in the future.
Thanks for your kind words.
Burhan is saying Eid Mubarak, all, and much love. I hope to see more sessions like this in the future. Good evening. Oh, that's lovely. Well, perhaps we could finish early then, yeah? Thank you, everybody, for being with us. And thank you for contributing to the stimulating nature of our meeting. And I can't thank you enough, Mufti Amjad. Thank you so much for being with us. And please thank your family as well for freeing you to be with us the end of your holiday.
Many thanks. Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks to everybody else as well. I hope today's been of some benefit and food for thought. We may not have solved all the world's problems, but at least we've had a conversation, and it will add to our learning as we carry on our journey in this world.
Well, keep learning. Here's the message. Thank you so much. Be well, everybody.
All the best.
Hope to see you again sometime soon.
All the best. You take care. Take care.
Bye. Bye. I'm always going to be the last to leave. Always. Yeah. Thanks again. Personally.
Thank you.
So much.
Pleasure.
I wish you well.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.